Welcome to Rapid Fire Wednesday, Q&A for corporate immigration professionals. I'm Kimberley Robidoux, a partner in our San Diego office, and I'm here today live in Boston with co-managing partner of our Boston office, Miki Matrician. Hey, good to see you in person.
Great to be with you.
And I'm hanging out for the month in Maine, so I thought it would be awesome to come down to Boston and we can do some of these, not necessarily live, but live for us, but not necessarily live on LinkedIn. So it's good to see you. And we decided that we were going to talk about a possible Trump 2.0 administration. And with that, we want to talk about some considerations, essentially 5 key takeaways, and just kind of looking at what it would look like if there would be a Trump 2.0 administration. So let us know what you think about that, Miki.
Yeah, so Kimberly and I thought it would be helpful just to do a little bit deeper dive on this topic because, we did talk about it in June with the global elections and the impact on immigration. But now that we have a new presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, and VP nominee, Tim Walz, we thought, let's do another deeper dive on Trump. And then also in another episode, we will talk about Harris and what kind of immigration policies she will pursue.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're going to talk about, specifically is policy changes that are going to be, really mindful for our HR and global mobility professionals. One of them on the employment side is Baja, right? We're not talking about Baja, California, which is the northern part of Mexico, right across the border from where I normally am sitting. But let's talk about Buy American, Hire American. Miki, can you explain what that was about in the prior Trump administration and what we would potentially expect to see going forward?
Yeah, so Baja was essentially a presidential, executive order. The policy was aimed at restricting immigration, all sorts of immigration, including employment-based. And I think the aim was to discourage companies from hiring foreign workers, right? And so what it did, in effect, was it was reading into the law requirements that were not rooted in the law. So, for example, U.S. consulates outside of the United States that are adjudicating visa applications, for instance, for L1 visas, the consular officers started adding in requirements for wages. That's not a requirement for L1 visas, but in effect, that's just one example of what started to happen under Baja when it was implemented. The other thing that happened was a significant increase in requests for evidence being issued and also denials being issued. I think that under the Trump administration, there was record high levels of denials. And so it really made it difficult for companies to onboard new talent. Even extensions that we can talk about a little bit later, extensions were at risk as well. And so it increased the costs for companies to onboard new talent. And also, there were delays because of these requests for evidence. And then sort of big picture, because of the increase in these RFEs, USCIS became extremely backlogged because it takes adjudicators a lot longer to go through the paperwork that is submitted in response to an RFE.
Okay, so that's Baja. One of the other things that we were talking about is just on the humanitarian side. So on the humanitarian side, some of the things that we've been hearing in the news and what would be a likely flow from what we saw in the prior Trump administration is what they're talking about rounding up the undocumented individuals in the U.S., which could be roughly 11 million plus, and placing them into deportation camps. So that would have, the effect of just clogging up the immigration courts, clogging up the regular courts as well with appeals, and just imagine the disruption in the community as well as for employers, all right? So on the humanitarian side, we have temporary protected status, which is for several countries. So we could see a rescission of TPS. A lot of people with TPS have employment authorization and they work for our clients. So if their TPS work authorization were to disappear, that would have a huge ripple effect in the economy. We could also see the revocation of humanitarian parole for individuals such as the Afghanis and Ukrainians. So that's something that we would anticipate. And, what our clients should start thinking about is that they could lose some part of their workforce. So that's primarily humanitarian, but what about on the employment side?
Yeah, and before we jump to that, the additional considerations on the employment side, I think just that, the DACA program could go away. That program is already in sort of a limbo status, and Trump tried to end the program, and so we would expect that those efforts would be renewed again in a Trump 2.0. So, in terms of employment-based, you know, we would expect more of the same from the last Trump administration in terms of travel bans. So, last administration, there was the Muslim travel ban, the COVID travel ban, and others. And so, even if people have valid visas or valid travel documents, it's important to have foreign nationals consider whether maybe they should not be traveling at least in the early part of the year to see what may come down the pike.
I remember that distinctly with a lot of interrupted travel plans. So if we're going to move over and talk a little bit about what we've been familiar with for many, many years, and it's the deference memo or the deference policy at USCIS. So when we're working with our clients and we're doing H-1Bs and L-1s and TNs, we're doing an extension, we're probably like, it's probably going to get approved. So what would we expect to see in a Trump point two with respect to the deference memo?
Yeah, so, I'm afraid that a Trump administration would rescind the deference memo once again. So the backdrop is that for many, many, many years, there was this longstanding policy at USCIS that essentially, if there was already an approval for the same kind of case, so same facts, right? Same job, same employer, extensions were generally expected to be approved because they already looked at it once. They were, it's not rubber stamping, but in general, they were not going to apply a really high level of scrutiny to an extension. When Trump came into office, he rescinded that. So what that meant was that every single petition, even an extension, was being looked at anew with a really high level of scrutiny. So that was sort of that went hand in hand with the BAHA, the Buy American, High American policy. And then when President Biden came into office, he rescinded that memo. So here we are now with the deference memo intact once again. But if Trump comes into office, we would expect that would be one of the first things that he would do is to rescind that policy again and make it difficult for employers.
Yeah, it's hard. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Republican plan of Project 2025 and just how that would have an impact on immigration. It would, likely result where we would have a Trump administration and then potentially Republican-controlled Congress. So a lot of what we're talking about also has, there's a lot of executive orders that the president can do. But if Congress is Republican as well, there's a lot more that can get through in terms of regulations. We were talking earlier about what they can make E-Verify mandatory for all employers. I know some employers are, happy to use E-Verify because that allows them for the STEM OPT extensions for their recent graduates, but it would really have a negative impact on a lot of other companies potentially. We also see potentially a merit-based immigration process, which would allow for only, I guess, the cream of the crop, right, to get permanent residence in the United States.
And the highest paid.
The highest paid. That's right. That's right. Looking at merit-based, and they had a criterion there of salary. So you had to be high salary professional.
Yeah.
So it would potentially eliminate a lot of individuals that would normally be coming to the United States to make the U.S. their home.
Yeah. For example, students, right? I mean, they're not going to be making the highest salaries. They're still at their beginning of their careers, but we definitely need that talent. And employers routinely are relying on F1 students and then transitioning them to other visa statuses. So, potentially those people could be shut out.
Yeah, which is a shame because if we're going to educate people here, we want our employers to be able to hire them.
Exactly. Why ship them back to their home country? We need the talent.
Exactly. So there's one thing with Project 2025. What else we were talking about? DACA processing.
Yep.
Right? So we would likely see a rescission of DACA. And then the other thing that we were talking about is just empowering the USCIS's fraud detection unit, which would be more site visits at companies to investigate and audit the H-1B program, the H-2A program, that would be under DOL, but USCIS could still do some audits, H-2B program as well under DOL. And then we could also see an increase in I-9 compliance and audits.
Yeah.
So
I totally agree. I mean, I think that, in general, compliance is going to be important to either administrations that's going to be coming into office, but particularly with the previous Trump administration, there was a lot more enforcement, right? So we would expect that to happen. And our advice to people would be, for HR professionals and global mobility professionals to be ready for that. With the specter of this potential Trump administration maybe coming in, it's important to be proactive now, I think, to kind of look at the immigration programs, look at the compliance programs, and have an action plan for the next several months.
Right. So what would you say some of that action plan should be? What should HR really look at primarily?
Yeah, so I think the first thing would be to audit the foreign national population and understand what visa statuses people hold, if people hold, TPS, like you mentioned, or if they're on EAD for DACA, to kind of have that as a plan, a consideration for planning if those programs go away. And the other thing is to audit, the foreign national population's job details against what was previously approved to make sure that everything's lined up, right? Sometimes HR doesn't find out about a promotion or location change until after it's happened. And so I think it's important. Now's a good time to kind of take the opportunity to take a deep dive and look at that. And then kind of using that, if there are job changes that could merit filing of an H-1B amendment, to use that as the hook for filing extensions earlier than the 6-month window and hopefully securing that approval before January.
Mm-hmm. So true. Yeah. The other thing that, thinking of it from a compliance perspective is to have litigation attorney counsel on hand, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Just get everything in order, know who your counsel is going to be, walk through some potential issues that the company could have so you have a strategy in place if you need to implement it.
Yeah. I think, in the last Trump administration, a lot of people turned to litigation because so many denials came out that were arbitrary and capricious, right? It was not rooted in the law. It was completely unfair. Sometimes those decisions were blatantly just on the face of it wrong, right? So I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind and for companies and individuals to be ready to litigate if necessary.
Right. Because as business immigration attorneys, we never went to court. We never litigated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Companies were always shy about litigating. And then under that administration, we saw a lot of litigation. So I think a lot of us got that experience.
Yeah.
So yeah, good point.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of what we're telling HR and global mobility professionals in terms of takeaways is, as I just said, file cases early when you can, right? Based upon review of the files, like if there is a change that could be material, maybe looking at that as an opportunity to file an amendment plus an extension together earlier than that 6-month window.
Audit I-9s.
Yeah.
Do an internal audit of I-9s so that you're aware of any potential mistakes or any issues that you can perceive in advance and maybe make some corrections if there's time.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely be aware of that and audit the I-9s.
Yeah.
So we also had talked about tell foreign nationals to avoid international travel in early 2025. As we saw last administration with Trump, there was a lot of travel bans and a lot of confusion with travel as well as with visa issuance. So try not to travel, even domestically. So where I am, at the border, there are a lot of checkpoints because CBP goes 100 miles from the border, which is 100 miles from the ocean. It's 100 miles from Mexico. So there's a lot of actual border checkpoints that people should be aware of.
That's a great point.
Another thing to think about. And then what do we say if there's, if you have a large workforce comprised of foreign nationals, like we were talking about TPS, but H's, L's, TNs, all those, just be aware that there could be an interruption in business operations.
Yeah, totally.
If we have to shut it down.
I want to add another one, which is to say, under the Biden administration, there was this huge push on STEM-based occupations, and that really kind of opened up the window for filing national interest waivers. And so there's a whole, this big increase in employers using that as a good mechanism to avoid perm, which we talked about in a previous episode. And that window could be closing, right, if it's a Trump administration. And so using this time now is right now, we still have several months in 2024. And so maybe thinking about using that as an opportunity to prepare those cases, get those filed, maybe do premium processing and secure that approval.
Yep. Agree 100%.
Yeah.
There's our takeaways. All right. So I think that's a wrap on a possible Trump 2.0 administration. So next one, talk about Harris.
Yeah.
And then if you don't already follow us on WR Immigration, please do on LinkedIn, our individual profiles. And then we will take this Rapid Fire Wednesday, turn it into a newsletter, and you can subscribe if you want to get that newsletter. Thanks, and good to see you in person.
Thanks, Kim.